To forget his first love who left without a word? After becoming a sergeant, that imperfect first love became his most beautiful. That day, he was drawing her face inside his uniform. Stephen was furious. It's pouring rain outside. Rainwater could flood the tunnels at any moment and drown all the men inside. Not dying like silent rats in a tunnel from a sneak attack gone wrong. They thought blowing up some explosives under a German bunker would earn them glory. Suddenly, the tunnel collapsed. One sapper was pinned by a beam and couldn't move. Even though it wasn't an infantryman, his superior gave orders without consulting him, sending men to do the deadliest and most disgraceful task. We don't go underground. But they are laying mines under the trenches. They'll dig through and break in. They need protection. Will you add that to my daily report, known as shilling a day, so they can defend themselves? That part was easy for Steve. The hard part was that some sappers refused to cooperate, just as Stephen ordered his men to check the shooting targets. The Germans launched a sudden bomb. The soldier checking the targets had his stomach ripped open. All he saw was Stephen, usually cold and stern, suddenly looking panicked and overwhelmed. You do. What's in there? I want you to think of her. Think of the last time you saw her. Think of her, dollish. For God's sake. Keep thinking. Keep gripping. Stephen didn't want him to die in pain and despair. Stephen was furious. He couldn't accept that a brave young just so he could teach those cowardly sappers how to shoot. All he could do was mock himself sarcastically. Provides daily lessons in the extraordinary simplicity of human anatomy. I never even knew there was another one inside the Sartorius. Not long after, Stephen discovered that Sapper Pharaoh had actually fallen asleep while on night patrol. German shellfire lit up the British trench like daylight. In such loud and dangerous conditions, no wonder Stephen's infantry worried constantly that these overly relaxed sappers would mix up friend and foe and blow up. Court-martial. Sergeant Major Price will drag you down into the wire. The next day, he brushed his teeth, put on his uniform, and went to see Stephen. After all, Pharaoh was the best sapper they had. After all, Pharaoh was there under Stephen's cold, emotionless gaze. His wife had written yesterday saying his condition had worsened. It was white monkey disease. That's it, but you're always somewhere else. Stephen, an orphan, Pharaoh wasn't good with words, but his gentleness flowed like a stream. Stephen's dazed expression made Pharaoh assume he was a father too. Just as Pharaoh thought Stephen might forgive him, Stephen suddenly turned harsh again. I have 2 men in a shell hole in no man's land 3 days, with their feet rotting in their boots. What if one of them falls asleep? He made Pharaoh draw a card to decide if he would be executed. He feared becoming another tragic victim of strict military orders. He drew the ace of spades, power and stability. My father's charge. At that moment, Stephen had no idea that soon his superior would order him to go into the tunnel. Only after that could they pack up and head to Amiens to join the main forces. That was where he had met and fallen in love with a place filled with sweet memory, not before he found her and asked why she had abandoned him. He had no choice but to go down. Almost too hard to breathe. For sure there's a hole. This isn't up to London Underground standard, barely wide enough to run a toy train through. Pharaoh's joke, but once inside, he was still shocked. It was dark, damp, and if they met the enemy, they could only crawl backward to escape. Holding their breath, they kept crawling forward. They heard Germans blowing up the tunnel and shouting as they quickly retreated, but still ran into in the fight. Stephen was shot in the left shoulder. He was the first to bring Stephen to the surface. Stephen, on the stretcher, suddenly thought of his first love again. He opened his eyes and found ahead of him were several soldiers with legs blown off. He could only close his eyes and wait. They rode away together in a carriage. They were full of hope for the future. The sentries thought he was dead. They tossed him into a pile of corpses, watching the man who replaced Stephen as section leader. He believed someone should at least send Stephen to let them know he was gravely wounded, near death. Only to find Stephen's name on the list of the dead. And found Stephen stripped of his uniform among a sea of corpses. Just as he was about to remove Stephen's death tag to send to his parents, and slowly opened his eyes. Pharaoh's eyes instantly turned red. He picked up Stephen as if he were gently carrying him away from that land of despair. Like warm, comforting sunlight, he carried the man who once threatened to execute him. Surviving such a disaster must mean future blessings. Once Stephen had mostly recovered, he would get 2 weeks' rest at home, then report to London for his new post. Anyone else would have jumped, but Stephen said he wanted to go with the troops to Amiens. But because Amiens helped, when Stephen returned to the front, his soldiers were stunned. They treated him like a phoenix reborn, and Stephen was truly glad to see his comrades safe and well. He even started caring about Pharaoh, the sapper. "How's your boy? Think he's crossed?" "He's on the mend." "Very good." At last, they reached scenic Amiens, and joke around with comrades like Pharaoh. He couldn't help but smile with them. But soon, a letter shattered their rare moment. Pharaoh's wife wrote to say their son had died. And for those 2 weeks, Pharaoh thought his son had recovered, eagerly hoping to return home and reunite with his wife and child. Drunk, Pharaoh went upstairs and began laughing about the blood and horror of war. His son was gone. He could die at any moment. Stephen rushed upstairs and helped the collapsing Pharaoh to his feet. He handed him a handkerchief to wipe away the vomit at the corner of his mouth. Was I good enough? Stephen didn't know how to comfort a grieving father. Pharaoh, a man from the bottom of society, had never owned a photo or portrait of himself. So, was she lucky? Yes. Even Pharaoh was still his wife's hope. Seeing him calm down at last, he stood alone outside the tavern, smoking. His first love, the one who vanished 6 years ago, had suddenly reappeared. But his feet had already moved, just like when he fell for Isabella at first sight 6 years earlier. Isabella suddenly quickened, but Stephen thought she had recognized him and was trying to run away again. But the figure said it was Jean, Isabel's sister. Looking at the house behind her, Stephen suddenly realized it was Isabel's ex-husband's estate. Last August, the estate was hit by an artillery shell. Spell she. She is alive. She's here. She's seen me. They're moving us to the front line tomorrow. Big push coming. I don't know when I'll be back, so, though injured and looking frail, and Stephen wasted no time and asked directly, "Do you know what you did to me?" Steve. Just left. Why? I can't. You shouldn't have come back. You should. Why? One day, you'll understand why I did what I did. That it was for the best. For him. For him. Are you the only woman I've ever loved? You were a boy. With one dismissive sentence, she crushed Stephen's devoted first love. But seeing the tears in her, Stephen's anger and hurt quickly turned into pity and sorrow. He gently caressed, not knowing what she'd been through in all these years of war. But as long as he could forgive everything from before. Isabel suddenly pushed him away. His eyes full of pain and disbelief. He couldn't accept that the woman he treasured as life itself only that their sweet, forbidden memories were nothing more than a game to her. He dragged a peacefully sleeping Weir to the village brothel to vent his rage. Weir had never been in love or even touched a woman. But just halfway through a cigarette, Weir came out crying. I've always been a little quick the first time. This is your expedition. You finish it. Stephen, filled with rage, was dying to vent all to stay faithful to, but her cold rejection now made him feel like a complete fool. His anger even drove him to the brink of wanting to kill the smiling prostitute before him. He still couldn't hate her. Deep down, the only thing he wanted was to be with Isabel again. Preparing to launch an assault on the Germans. Before battle, the general lied, saying the German barbed wire had already been cut. But just before departure, each soldier was issued wire cutters. Stephen's suspicions. He calmed the uneasy troops first, then went to question the commanding. The officer came clean. The British had never destroyed the German barbed wire. They were ordered to break through the wire with their bodies. On the day of the attack, which basically warned the Germans that an attack was coming, Stephen still had to lead his men into battle as they had to charge through gunfire, run 3.7 kilometers to the Battle of the Somme was nothing short of hell. Intellectuals, students and teachers all fought side by side and died side by side, surrounded by nothing but blood and corpses. Family status, education level all seemed meaningless because pain and suffering had been etched into the soul of a nation. The only thing people can do is desperately cling to the last sliver of hope. I'm writing this because you are the only woman I've ever, and I fear that I may never see you again. I hope one day to understand what has passed between us. But pray for me as well. Pray that I return and that we shall meet again. Steve. Amid the chaos of battle, Stephen, blown into a pile of corpses, opened his eyes once again. It was as if Isabel's love was calling him, driving him to keep going. But somehow, he survived. The moment Weir saw Stephen, his eyes immediately welled, but not because they both survived a fingling God. My God, I answered. No one can bear the sight at such a young age of flesh crushed into mud. Young people from peaceful times can never imagine the pain tolerance of those who let us pray we never have to find out. As the war neared its end, he made a trip back to Amiens. When the estate was bombed, but her lungs and heart were badly damaged, Jean moved out of the estate to a small house on the outskirts, and finally understood why Isabel had left him all those years ago. You were not ready, that perhaps you would never be ready. For a time, I swore to Isabel I would never tell you. But, please, Stephen, stay. Meet her properly. She is strong, so like her mother. That's why she was, because she was already pregnant, and Stephen was only earning. He often said he didn't want kids because he was an orphan himself. Under those circumstances, if Isabel had insisted on having the child, giving birth and raising the child on her own, she couldn't cope alone anymore. Hearing the truth, Stephen was overwhelmed with guilt. He wanted to immediately acknowledge his daughter, but seeing how happy and well she was under Jean's, he couldn't promise to stay by her side. He chose to respect Isabel's wishes and live a happy life forever, and resolutely returned to the army. Stephen was still in shock and grief. His friend Weir was shot in the head by a German sniper while making way for fellow soldiers. Once again, Stephen was speechless in the face of fate's cruelty and life's fragility. Weir's name would be honored on a glorious monument. One day, while eavesdropping on the Germans above, it was too late to retreat. When Stephen woke up, he found only Firebrace had survived among the miners. Then carried him step by step toward the exit. Since hearing of Isabel's death, Stephen's luck had, as he waited hopelessly for death, his daughter's sweet smiles like a lighthouse in the dark, guiding a lost sailor home, vibrant. I loved a woman once, very much, and she loved me. Who am I, drunk and still asking for ice cream? Fueled by the will to survive, Stephen got back on his feet. Though all exits were blocked, he stumbled across hundreds of boxes of German explosives. He dragged the explosives while calling out to Firebrace. But Firebrace's eyes had already gone glassy. He was slipping away, with no fear of death at all. A beautiful boy. He was the best of me. There was nothing more, sir, to love, and they loved. These words woke Stephen up. For years, he'd been upset and whether she had ever truly loved him. But sometimes, the act of, after all, in the face of harsh reality and cruel war, the strength to grit their teeth and the courage to, like a father, Firebrace taught Stephen this with his life. Stephen finally blew open the tunnel and escaped. Two German soldiers suddenly approached him. Unarmed, Stephen clenched his fists but the German soldiers simply smiled and said, "It's over. No more life or death battles." He collapsed into the enemy's arms, weeping silently. And every comrade now, all he had left was his daughter. Once, he feared having children, living untethered, fearless. He finally understood children are not just a legacy. In the sunlight, the French countryside was lush and full of life, and his daughter ran toward him